Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the National Museum of Language. I'm Laura Murray. I'm the president of the museum, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone here for our special presentation about Taíno language. Um, so for those of you who are new to the National Museum of Language and have never been to one of our presentations before, I'm going to just give you a brief introduction to who we are and what we do, not to take too much time. But the National Museum of Language is a unique, fully virtual museum. We don't have a building, so we exist online. We have a website. We have online speaker programs such as the one today. We have exhibits on our website. And occasionally we do in-person presentations in our local area here in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, but that's relatively rare. We are a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We're dedicated to examining the history, impact, and art of language. That's pretty broad because we're talking about all languages. And there are many language museums around the world, but most of them focus on one language, the language of the country where the museum is located, rather than being multilingual as we are. As a nonprofit, we're guided by our mission, and we are supported by members, donors, and volunteers. We don't have an institutional sponsor. That gives us a lot of freedom to do the kinds of programming that we would like to do. Our mission statement you may have seen on our website is to honor and support language acquisition, utilization, and preservation, along with linguistic and cultural diversity. Through our outreach activities and online resources, we celebrate the magic and beauty of human communication. We are a small museum, but we explore the transformative powers of language. We opened to the public first on May 3rd, 2008, after more than 10 years in the making. We've been a trailblazer in this field. There are no more than 3 museums in the world with a similar focus, that is a multilingual focus. And we examine the history, impact, and art of language. We offer a wide range of exhibits and resources for language experts, students, and the general public. Most exhibits are multilingual, featuring content in the original language as well as English translation. Examples of some of our exhibits include children's stories from around the world, poetry, and international humor, among others. We also have a robust speaker program on a variety of topics, from vampires to endangered languages. And that was just this year. Um, we're also connected to a lot of other language museums and organizations of that nature. This year, we broke down one barrier. We became a member of the American Alliance of Museums. And this was a big deal for us because we had been rejected for years because we didn't have a building. But I guess they just finally decided to move into the 21st century, and they accepted us as a real museum into their organization. We're also a member of a group called the International Network of Language Museums, which is very interesting. There are museums in 27 countries around the world, and we meet online and learn about each other's museums and exhibits. We also collaborate with experts from numerous educational institutions and research organizations. For example, we had a big focus on African languages, literature, and poetry, and we collaborated with Howard University in Washington, D.C., to get expert support with that. That's an example of collaboration. So that's a very brief rundown of who we are and what we do. Again, we welcome all of you here today, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. And I'm going to hand this over to Greg to introduce our speaker.
Okay, Laura, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. I have a loud voice, it's not usually a problem. I'm Greg Nedved. I'm the former president of the museum, and now I'm the speaker program chair. And I want to introduce Priscilla. And I have to admit, I'm not going to be very original here. I'm just going to read her bio that was on our website. It's 3 paragraphs. It's perfect. We'll get so for those of you that have read it already, you're going to hear it again. If you haven't, then great. Okay, Priscilla Colon is a Taíno writer, artist, teacher, and self-proclaimed language nerd, as she said earlier. or what she'll probably say again, with over 20 years of experience training diverse language learners and instructors from government personnel to public school teachers and students. Okay. Driven by her search for her own indigenous roots, Priscilla founded Casa Areto with and I'm sure I mispronounced it, with the mission to create a world where every Taíno descendant knows who they are and where they came from. As a proud UNESCO partner, Casa Areto actively contributes to the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, IDIL 2022-2032, supporting global efforts to revive the Taíno language through public events and free online resources, including the first Taíno digital course, which is currently in development. This is the last paragraph because I know you're all anxious to get to the speaker. In June 2024, Priscilla was appointed co-chair of UNESCO's Ad Hoc Group 1, which is provision of education and domains for indigenous languages for IDIL 2022-2032. She's thrilled to honor the rich linguistic and cultural heritage of her Taíno ancestors by using her voice, experience, and passion to help shape global policies for indigenous languages. At this point, I'm delighted to turn the podium over to Priscilla. Thank you, Priscilla.
Hahom, thank you for the lovely introduction. Thank you for the opportunity for me to be here and share with you something that I am absolutely passionate about, that I feel is my life's calling. And Mabrika, welcome to all of you to our presentation, From Hammocks to Hurricanes, Taíno Influence on Language and Culture. So I bet most of you here today didn't know that you speak an indigenous language, and that language is Taíno. Yes, that's right. You use this language every day because even though it was thought to be extinct, this language is everywhere. Words like hammock, barbecue, and potato, iguana, maize, and savanna, and so many countless others were integrated into the English, Spanish, French language, and I dare say probably most other languages in the world. But the impact of Taíno goes beyond linguistics. So if you've ever relaxed in a hammock, enjoyed a barbecue, or traveled by canoe, you've unknowingly adopted the traditions and ways of life of the Taíno indigenous people of the Caribbean, my ancestors. And many of you have done so without realizing it, and there's an important reason for this. One, most people have never heard of Taínos, unfortunately, because as the first Indigenous Americans of contact in 1492, they experienced the brunt of colonization and forced assimilation. And by the late 1500s, the Spanish crown declared Taínos extinct. So, in the eyes of the law, Taínos don't exist. I don't exist. And this message was reinforced not just through historical text, but also through images. So, for example, the couple of images that you see at the top of your screen depict Columbus's first landing in Abya, the mature land, as many indigenous people call it. But Taínos are barely present. Many of them are kind of blending in the shadows, if they're there at all. And a second reason is that those who learn about Taíno people do so through European colonizers' accounts, which often describe our ancestors as naive, like children, romping half naked through the tropical rainforests, so docile that in Columbus's own words, they would make good slaves. And these portrayals were, of course, heavily biased. They were used to justify colonization, enslavement, and erasure. But the truth is very different than what's written in the history books. The Taíno story, past and present, really connects us all. Today, we're going to explore our ancestors' sophisticated society, including their egalitarian system of governance, advanced agriculture, scientific knowledge that we're just starting to uncover today with modern technology, and their deeply spiritual practices that maintain balance with nature. We're also going to discover the global influence on language, culture, and even our own daily lives that our ancestors had. And of course, talk about the truth that Taínos are not extinct. that we're thriving and leading efforts to revitalize our language and our culture. So let's first find out who our ancestors were through the perspectives of modern day Taíno academics who are using an interdisciplinary approach and modern technology to paint a whole new picture, a more realistic view of who they were. The Taíno homelands, first of all, the traditional Taíno homelands comprise the islands of the Caribbean, many of which you know: Puerto Rico, whose original name was Boriquen; Jamaica, Jamaica; Haiti, which is the island now comprising Haiti and the Dominican Republic; Cuba, we have Bahamas, Virgin Islands, and also parts of what we consider now the southern part of the US, Florida. And the Caribbean was really prime real estate. You can see it from your screen because of its location. It was the hub of commerce and exchange. Like the Polynesians of the Pacific, Taínos were great navigators. That's how they arrived on the islands. So for thousands of years, people traveled from the north, central, and southern parts of this continent. They were creating a society that comprised a variety of languages and cultures. They were not a homogeneous society. Even the name Taíno that we assign to ourselves is really just a way to name all of these many different peoples with different traditions. The Taíno were not people who lived in isolation and were ignorant of the world. They were part of an extensive trade network where they exchanged not just basic goods, but luxury items. For example, archaeological finds of amber, amethyst, jade, and turquoise in the Caribbean suggest ancient trade routes stretch from what is modern-day Brazil to Mexico and the US Southwest. Plant DNA that is now being analyzed by ethnobotanists using this new technology. So they're taking this plant DNA from ancient tools and pottery, and it's now showing that agricultural traditions in the Caribbean began thousands of years than earlier believed. Crops like maize, sweet potato, yucca, and hot peppers were reaching the islands soon after domestication on the mainland continent. So we have evidence from about 7,000 years ago of many of these crops on the islands. Plants like yucca need to be heavily processed in order to become edible for humans. They're toxic without understanding this process of to create this food, to create things like casabe, which is a bread created from yucca, and so on. So this really talks about the in-depth knowledge that was gained through thousands of years to be able to eat. Even the guinea pig we're now finding, which is a delicacy that comes from Peru and the areas of Colombia, was part of this ancient exchange. So they found guinea pig remains all over the Caribbean. And in the central parts of Boriquen, which is modern-day Puerto Rico, it's still consumed. It's even believed that the Taíno word cori comes from the Quechua word cuy. So we see that these people were in constant contact before colonization. Our ancestors, we know, were skilled navigators. That's how they traveled to the islands, and they navigated with the stars. However, we really weren't understanding the depth and breadth of their knowledge of astronomy until very recently. So in 2017, a study revealed that the Thebes Indigenous Ceremonial Center, which you see here on the screen, which is part of the southern part of the island of Boriquen, Puerto Rico, it was discovered that this is actually the largest astronomical observation site found to date in the Caribbean. They found 150 stone and petroglyph alignments with stars in the sky. A set of star stones, which you also see pictured here on the screen, were also found. And it's believed that they not only functioned as a sundial during the day, but it was a device to plot the stars in the night sky. So our ancestors were using these gigantic sites to track celestial events. But our ancestors also knew how to have fun. Boriquen, Puerto Rico, is thought to have been the ultimate sports hub, with ceremonial centers featuring 7 to 10 plazas where people played a game called batu. This was the predecessor of modern-day soccer. Both men and women played the game either on the same team or on separate teams. and competitors came from across the Caribbean and beyond to play in tournaments. So this was the original World Cup. But of course, everything changed in 1492 with the arrival of Europeans. But it wasn't a one-sided story. Europeans were also profoundly changed. Taíno innovations, language, culture, they all left an indelible mark, and they ended up playing a huge part of global history. Because when they first came, Europeans witnessed things they had never seen before: foods, tools, plants, methods for processing plants, and traditions. And they tried to write down what they heard. But of course, many sounds were missed or mixed up along the way, which led to changes in pronunciation over time. Now, we believe that part of this is due to the fact that Taíno was primarily a spoken language. There was no known standard writing system, at least not one that we've confirmed yet, because there have been recent archaeological finds that suggest there was a pre-Columbian writing system. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, the really cool finds that are being explored now later on in this presentation. I also have to note that the first language encountered by Taínos, the first European language, was Spanish, which also did not have a writing system in 1492. The first official Spanish dictionary was not published until the early 1600s, if I'm not mistaken. But despite these challenges, many Taíno words were integrated into European languages, and we're going to take a look at a few examples. So let's start with hammock. Many of you are very familiar with hammocks. Well, the word hammock actually comes from Taíno, and the Taíno word is hamaca. And hamaca is believed to actually have a definition within its name made up of two parts, ha and maca or mako. Ha referring, a particle referring to something that hangs, and maca or mako referring to a woven item. Now, hamaca became hamaca in Spanish. They dropped that ha at the beginning. It became hammock in English, dropping the ka at the end. And in French, it became hamac, dropping the ha and the ka. So you can see how one word became three different words as it moved from language to language. And the hammock was a practical and comfortable invention by the Taíno people. It really had a huge impact on seafaring. So unlike traditional beds or wooden bunks, hammocks allowed sailors to rest comfortably in a very limited space. So hammocks became standard in maritime culture, and now they've spread everywhere from our homes to outdoor settings, vacation spots. The Taínos also had a huge impact on agriculture and cuisine. Just from the pictures you see here, we're going to be talking about some of these things. But I'll have to note that even though many of these crops didn't originate in the Caribbean, Europeans first encountered them through the Taíno people. And as a result, the Taíno words and methods for cultivating and processing these crops became deeply ingrained into world languages and cuisines. And it wasn't just Europe. Many of these crops are now cultivated in places as far away as China. So let's start with maize. Of course, in American English, we use the word corn, but maize is another word that is used for it. Why? Well, it comes from Taíno. The word is maíz, and this word was integrated into all of the languages that you see here. Now, maize traces back to Mesoamerica, this area here that encompasses Mexico and Central America. It's believed to be more than 9,000 years old. It's often considered the first genetically engineered crop because scientists don't really know how our indigenous ancestors transformed it from this wild type of grass into the crop that it is today. Now, one of the oldest ways in which our ancestors consumed maize was popcorn. And there's evidence of popped popcorn dating back to 5,600 years ago. This ancient treat was discovered in a cave in New Mexico. So it shows how incredible our people were in creating these tasty treats. What would movies be like today without popcorn, or a day at the carnival, or even watching some Netflix, right? So another important crop, I'm sure most of you eat this quite a lot, is the potato. And the word potato itself comes from Taíno. The original word was batata. Now, the original meaning of batata was specific. It actually meant sweet potato, like the kind that you see on the screen. There are many different varieties of sweet potatoes still grown in the Caribbean. However, when the word was incorporated into English, it lost a little bit of its meaning. So it still means potato, but it could mean any old regular potato, not just the sweet kind. It's interesting that in Spanish, they adopted Taíno for sweet potato, batata, but for regular potato, they adopted another indigenous word from the Quechua, papa. So I love these kind of tidbits where you see people borrowing words here and there. Now, I mentioned Quechua. There's an important reason for this. The potato actually originated in the Andes Mountains about 8,000 years ago. And it was a key innovation because it survived high altitudes and especially in cold climates, it was very hardy. Now, Peru, which is thought to be the home of the potato, has more than 4,000 varieties of them. You see some of them here on the screen. Some of them are curved and bumpy. Some of them look like bunches of grapes. They're all different kinds of colors, not just your regular old quote unquote Idaho potato that you see at your supermarket. But beyond nutrition, potato was medicine. So I have to tell you, I was in Peru a couple of years ago. And when you're in the mountains, you see these stone structures everywhere, like very specific looking stone structures. And our guide pointed them out and he said, hey, like you notice the stone structure, they've got what look like windows, like areas that are open. And these were openings left in on purpose. The indigenous people would pile up the potatoes in the middle of the stone structure. The wind from the mountains would blow through and it would desiccate the potato. And I was wondering, why are they eating desiccated or dried up potato? Well, actually, inside desiccated potatoes, a type of antibiotic is produced, very similar to penicillin. And then when you ingest it, you're actually giving yourself medicine. And this is something that is still used nowadays in modern day Peru. It was only recently that scientists discovered that this antibiotic was being produced. But can you imagine the scientific and medical ingenuity that our people developed to be able to start using these desiccated as medicine, these desiccated potatoes as medicine? Of course, we know the potato traveled the world. It had a global impact. And it wasn't just potatoes, it was maize and chocolate and tomatoes and peanuts, so many other foods that came from Indigenous America. The potato, however, was very specifically helped European populations doubled because, for example, in Nordic countries, it was able to thrive in the cold climates. In Ireland, the potato became the primary source of food. Some people survived on 1 or 2 potatoes a day. The estimates are that the European population doubled in about 100 years, just from the influx of all these indigenous crops. And in Ireland, specifically, the population went from an estimated 1.5 million to 8.5 million in 200 years. But of course, Europeans made a very costly mistake. They planted only a few varieties of the potatoes. And without this genetic diversity, once these like algae-like, fungus-like, crop devastating microorganisms hit, it really caused them to be vulnerable to disease. And this is where we get that famous Irish potato famine. This is what happened. So it wasn't enough to borrow the crops. It was really important for them to borrow the traditional ways of planting, which they really didn't quite understand. So let's turn to another type of culinary practice that has spread around the world, and that is barbecue. This is also a Taíno tradition, and it's a word originally called that the original word was barbacoa. It was borrowed and integrated into the Spanish language. And if you say barbacoa, many people believe that you're speaking Spanish, but you're not. You're actually speaking Taíno. This word, of course, changed a little bit when it was integrated into the English. Now, nowadays, barbecues are ubiquitous. You go to family barbecues, there are barbecue joints in every city, and we use barbecue to mean everything from the grill to the food or even the sauces. But the original word barbacoa didn't mean any of that. Barbacoa was the process of smoking meats and vegetables on a platform above an open flame. So the food isn't getting direct heat. Instead, it's being cooked by the steam or the vapor or the smoke, which leaves it with that like juiciness and smokiness and that rich flavor. Now, we've talked about Taíno influence on food and daily life, but did you know that Taínos also had an impact on meteorological science? So just take a quick look at the picture that you see on the screen. As many of you know, hurricanes that hit this part of the world form off the coast of Africa, and they move straight to the Caribbean. So our people understood this phenomenon of hurricanes. And this is also where Europeans heard that word for the first time. And the word is huracán. Huracán was integrated into all of the languages that you see. But what's really interesting is I've loved researching Taino because you can see the meanings of these words right within the word itself. So let's take a look at the word huracán. It's made up of two parts. Hura, which means wind, and can, which is an abbreviation of a larger word, nakan, which means center. So the definition of the word literally is center of the wind. That tells you that our ancestors understood that this was wind blowing around a center. I don't know about you, but if I'm in the middle of a hurricane, I'm looking to like find some safety somewhere. I'm not trying to track where the wind is moving. But this tells me that like there's some in-depth knowledge happening here. How do we know that they actually knew? Well, we have drawings. Literally, this is a drawing right here from a Cuban ceramic. And you see the center kind of looks like a human face. And you see these arms here are the movements of the wind. Well, guess what? Our modern symbol for hurricane, that symbol that is used by meteorologists, it's basically the same thing. It's the same logo. And the arms are actually moving in the same direction, a clockwise direction. The only way that I know that a hurricane's arms are moving in that direction is because I've seen satellite images. So I don't understand how our ancestors, without satellite images, knew that the hurricane was moving in this direction, since hurricanes are miles long, right? Yeah, we're gonna have to figure out how they knew that sometime. Now, what's really cool, and I'm finding it amazing, is that many Taino traditions are now being introduced into popular culture with movies such as Avatar. Now, Avatar, we know that James Cameron created Avatar based on that first encounter between Europeans and indigenous people. And there were little nods of it here and there, like the clothing, the weapons, traditions that were shared among indigenous Americans. But there were some other interesting tidbits that were particularly ascribed to Taínos. Let's take a look at some of those. One of them is bioluminescence. It's the ability of plants and animals to produce their own light. If you saw the Avatar movies, in many of those, you'll notice that, for example, as they're stepping around the forest in the middle of the night, the plants start lighting up. Even the Na'vi, the alien creatures themselves, have that kind of glow in the dark feature. Well, I'm not saying that our ancestors were 11 feet tall, blue and glowed in the dark. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that bio bays themselves, bioluminescent bays, are very prominent in the Caribbean, in places like Puerto Rico and Jamaica, Cayman Islands, Virgin Islands. You can actually go and canoe at night in these bio bays. And what happens is that as you're canoeing, you're disturbing the microorganisms in the water and they start to glow. There are even accounts of our ancestors going fishing with their nets at night because it was easy to catch fish if you're running your net through the water and the microorganisms start to glow. You can see in the dark. Another really cool tidbit that you may have seen in the movie was the sacredness of trees. So the Na'vi had a home tree, the tree of souls that connected them to their ancestors. The indigenous people also have a sacred tree. It is the ceiba tree. And that ceiba tree is thought to be the connector among the three realms. The branches go up into the realm of the Great Spirit, Yaya, the creator. The trunk is in the middle, which is here in the realm of the living, and the roots are connected to the underworld, the realm of our ancestors. So that was a really cool kind of link or thread to the Taíno spirituality. I also have to say that the sacredness of trees is something shared by Indigenous people all around the world as well. There was another linguistic nod that I'd love to spend a little bit of time on, and that is the use of the word cassock when they referred to the Navi chief. And that word cassock comes from Taíno. The original word was cacique, and that word was borrowed and integrated into Spanish as is. It became cassock in English, and it became cacique in French. We believe that that word is comprised of three parts, ka, isi, or ishi, ke. And it means literally the point, head, or leader of this land. Now, it might surprise you to know that Taínos had male and female chiefs. This really showcased gender equality, which is characteristic of all of Taíno society. Jalil Suedbadillo was a Puerto Rican historian who uncovered significant details of Taíno female chiefs. For example, there's a 1514 record that shows that there were 36 female chiefs in Haiti, that island that is shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Boriquen, he was able to uncover 13 female chiefs. Boriquen is modern-day Puerto Rico. Now, this doesn't mean that these were the names of all of the female chiefs that existed throughout Taíno history. We don't have accounts before colonization, and many of these accounts became less and less known. He also discovered in his research that there was systematic gender erasure. So many female chiefs' names were only mentioned in passing. Some female chiefs, their names were deliberately erased, or their gender was altered or misrepresented in historical records. So I'd like to take a few minutes to speak about the women that you see on the screen. Let's start with the left here. And this is a statue of Cacique Osema, which is in Santo Domingo, the capital of the Dominican Republic. It is right on top of where her village is. Actually, the capital, Santo Domingo, was established on top of her village, and there's a reason. So, according to accounts, there was a fugitive Spaniard by the name of Miguel Diaz. He was running away from his compatriots because he actually injured another Spaniard, and he was either going to be arrested or killed or both. As he's running away, he happens to on this Taíno village, who is run by Cacique Osema. She takes him in. No one knew this village existed, by the way. She takes him in. They become friendly, and they have a couple of children. The first of which, Miguelico, like little Miguel, literally that's his name, becomes the first ever recorded Taíno Spaniard in the world. This is documented history. So we know that she ends up baptized later on and changes her name to Catalina. And now we have the capital of the Dominican Republic established where her village is. The woman in the middle, this is a statue of Ana Caona, who is an amazing chief, one of the best known Taíno chiefs, regardless of gender. And this statue is where it's believed her home village was, which is in Leogon, Haiti. Ana Caona was known as the Great Diplomat. When the Spaniards first landed on her island, there were battles, actually. Her husband went out and killed the first settlement of every single Spaniard because they had started stealing, all kinds of pillaging and raping and all kinds of things. And because of that, her husband was arrested, killed, and she and her brother, who were chiefs through their matrilineal lines, started establishing peace talks. They really, these new people were coming in. They didn't want their people injured. They established peace talks. She became known as the Great Diplomat and was able to sustain relative peace with the Spaniards for about 6 years. She is memorialized in everything from songs and movies, and statues and books, really a great leader. The woman here on the right-hand side is from the island of Boriquen, modern-day Puerto Rico. This painting is actually of another chief from a female chief from Venezuela, but I used it because it really depicts the nature of Cacique Guayerbas. Cacique Guayerbas was a chief in the center part of the island in what is now called Utuado. She was part of the Taíno-Spanish War, one of the leaders of that war, a rebellion against the Spanish that lasted almost 20 years. Her fighters were associated with the burning of the first Spanish capital of the island. And because of that, her name was systematically erased. And her gender was even changed in historical accounts. And it's thanks to Jalil Suedbadillo that we even know her name today. I'm sure was incredibly embarrassing for the Spaniards who were from this very patriarchal society, who had these very misogynist views, to then have to say, well, this woman and her fighters ended up burning our first capital on the island. But I also have to note that female leadership was very common in Indigenous American societies, most of which were matrilineal societies. So you trace your family through your mother's line. The children belonged to the mother's clan, and even the husbands would go live with their wives' families. And so lineage as the head of a household or chieftains, right? That was passed down through the family line. So it's not a surprise that there would be men and women who would be the heads of households or the chiefs. This is also common in North and South America. It wasn't just Taínos. The Seneca and Tuscarora have oral traditions that assert that their first chief was a female, Godacillo. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is still known to have the powerful clan mother who decides who the next chief will be. In South America, you have the Sinu people in modern-day Colombia, the Guajiro and Yaruro people in modern-day Venezuela, and even the Locono people themselves from Guyana have words that are very similar that talk about the heads of households. Now, what happened? What happened to this vibrant culture that was highly skilled at agriculture, that had scientific knowledge of astronomy, navigation, meteorology, that had an egalitarian society in which men and women were equal? Why were Taínos declared extinct by the late 1500s? Well, Columbus's foreboding words came to pass. The Taíno people were systematically captured and sold into slavery, sent to Europe or other parts of the Spanish colonies. Columbus himself kidnapped 25 Taínos. The numbers aren't really clear because only 8 survived the trip back to Spain. He brought them back to show off to the king and queen as proof that he had found Japan. But the Spanish themselves, the crown, established the encomienda system. This system granted Spanish settlers control over Taíno lands and the people themselves. They forced Taíno to provide labor, and in return, they would provide protection and religious instruction. Of course, this just led to widespread abuse, grueling behavior, grueling labor, and violence. Even the chiefs or the heads of families themselves were forced to labor in the mines. A lot of what happened next was religious and cultural persecution. The Taínos were brutally persecuted. Many of these accounts are detailed by the Spanish themselves in their chronicles, and they were being forced, our Taíno ancestors were being forced to accept Christianity. We have the famous story of resistance by Cacique Atue, which you see a drawing of here on the screen. Right before this chief who refused to succumb or be dominated by the Spanish, right before he was to be burned alive, a Spanish priest asked if he would convert to Catholicism so he could go to heaven. And when he found out that heaven is where all of the Spanish would be, he said, "I would rather go to hell than spend eternity with such terrible people." The 1503 massacre of Haiti is also famously documented in Spanish chronicles. You see artistic renderings from these chronicles where hundreds of Taíno people were killed in a brutal attack at a gathering, a ceremonial gathering for peace talks. This gathering had been arranged by our famous diplomat, Ana Caona, who had maintained 6 years of relative peace. She wouldn't have thought that suddenly all her people would be massacred. So she had asked all the chiefs, all of the families, and the Spanish to come to this gathering. And Nicolas de Ovando, who was the Spanish governor at the time, betrayed them all and ordered a brutal attack. Hundreds of people died, children, elders, anyone. There was no mercy shown. And Ana Kaona herself, which you see here pictured on the screen, was arrested and later hanged. Because Taínos were laboring in mines and fields for cash crops that would be sent to Europe, this led to, in a majority, a great collapse of the agricultural system and famine. New evidence is also being found that says that things like the introduction of cattle and a meat-heavy diet also worsened people's health along the way. Taínos had mostly a plant-based diet. There was also disease. European diseases like smallpox, measles, and others were introduced to the Americas, and our ancestors didn't have immunity for that. And after many years and numerous attempts of trying to maintain the peace with the Spanish, of course, tensions escalated into open war. On the island of Boriquén, Puerto Rico, there was a nearly 20-year Taíno-Spanish war, and it caused devastating losses to our people. Despite this, the Taíno demonstrated remarkable resilience. They formed alliances with other indigenous groups, and they launched coordinated attacks against the Spanish, even as they were being driven off the islands themselves. And in response, the Spanish systematically suppressed resistance by hunting down and arresting leaders, such as Cacique Guayerbas. They even sent them off as enslaved, captured enslaved people to either other islands or across to Europe to continually crush the efforts of the Taíno people. But the number one cause of Taíno extinction wasn't famine, disease, persecution, or enslavement. The number one cause is actually more surreptitious than that. It was paper genocide. And paper genocide is defined as the systemic removal of a group of people from historical records. Now, Dr. Juan Manuel Delgado, he's one of the people who has studied this the most. He's a historian and professor at the Center for Advanced Studies of Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. And he's really pointed to significant discrepancies in historical records. Number one, he believes that the population was really, the number of people was really misrepresented. Estimates on the number of Taínos in 1492 on the island of Haiti, just one island, estimates vary from 60,000 to 8 million. People don't really know. It's a huge range. In Boriquén, in 1493, they're estimated at 1 million. But again, no one really knows. He also points to flawed census records. As early as 1531, key groups of people were being omitted from the censuses. So first he says, yeah, Taíno women weren't counted. Children under a certain age weren't counted. Why wouldn't you count Taíno women? They're making up, I'm assuming, about 50% of the population, and Taíno women would be literally giving birth to the next generation. Taínos who never submitted to the Spanish crown and lived in the areas called Indieras, literally the areas of the Indians in the mountainous regions, they were never counted because the Spanish never went up there looking for people to count. Taínos who had gained their freedom were never counted. Those who weren't actively working in the encomienda system were never counted. And even those Taínos who had assimilated and were serving in Catholic parishes weren't counted. He also points to a real issue that comes up with the reclassification of Taíno people throughout the censuses. So Taínos were reclassified under colonial categories such as mulatto, which is a mixed black-white, or mestizo, an indigenous person who's also mixed with white, based on skin color, hair texture, very arbitrary, subjective things. And then, as the censuses proceeded, many of these categories ended up just being erased, and everyone was lumped into one category, which was simply pardo, which means brown or colored person. So that just continually erased the Taíno identity from official records, contributing to this quote unquote Taíno extinction. Moreover, Dr. Delgado points to something else, which was the drastic change in educational materials in Puerto Rico itself. By the 1950s, he points out that children's textbooks had begun speaking about our Taíno ancestors as extinct, that they may have contributed somewhat to our foods and our music and maybe a bit of the language here and there, but not much else. So the population began to mistrust what they saw with their very own eyes and heard with their ears, and even the words that they were speaking themselves, which originated in our Taíno language. My parents, who were born in the 1930s and 40s, were a product of this education. So even though they could see that they themselves were indigenous, they could see it in their parents and their grandparents, it was almost like Taínos are these separate people that no longer exist. They're not us. I've heard from people who are my age who went through the education system on the island in the 1980s and 90s who are still receiving this information. But in 2010, there was a huge change that began happening, a kind of awakening. And this was due to genetic analysis. Dr. Juan Carlos Martinez Cruzado, whom you see on the screen, is a professor of genetics at the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez. In 2010, he released the results of his pioneering study of indigenous ancestry of Puerto Ricans. And lo and behold, 61% of Puerto Ricans has indigenous mitochondrial DNA. And what does that mean, mitochondrial DNA? The DNA that you get from your mother. You know, those women who weren't being counted? So 61% of the population. I mean, that's a huge number. And this proved once and for all what we already knew to be true, right? This was being pointed way back then. You know, anthropologists were talking about the foods we eat, the indigenous methods of planting and harvesting that had been passed down, the use of traditional and plant medicines and herbal remedies, spiritual traditions, those syncretic religious practices that were infused in the Caribbean were just all coming from a Taíno indigenous basis of belief. Now, as someone who's worked with languages my whole career, something I'm passionate about, what's really exciting is that linguists started reconstructing the language. Now, we don't have a lot of documented Taíno. The ranges are pretty wide, anywhere from 500 to 3,000 Taíno words and phrases, if you include toponyms, that is place names, or people's names. However, they're using sister languages from South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. So sister languages are those languages that have the same root, that are in part of the same language family. So languages such as the Arawak language that is spoken by the Lokono people, or Garifuna and Wayu, to name a few. And this is where my work with Taíno actually began. So in 2019, I had just turned 40 years old, and I started asking myself some really hard questions, like, who am I? What am I doing with my life? And it was really just something that these questions kind of prompted me to go into this journey of self-discovery, because I had been educated here in the United States. I had learned about the Taíno people as this like very different people who had died off in the Caribbean. My parents had said, well, of course we're indigenous, but they really didn't understand that much of what they were passing on was actually indigenous. So I had this urge to research. And because I worked with languages, I kind of went in that direction. I said, maybe there's a language out there. Maybe you can pick up some words. I'd love to like learn some full sentences. And at first I wasn't finding much, a dictionary here or there, not enough to even make complete sentences. That is until I came across this amazing book, Primario Básico del Taíno Boriquenaiki. It's a primer to the Taíno language. And it was written by Javier Hernandez, who you see on the screen. Javier Hernandez is an amazing hyper polyglot. He speaks 10 different languages. He reads and writes in another 13. I think he's studying 4 more. This guy's amazing. And he happens to be Taíno Boricua, like me. He had spent 9 years trying to reconstruct the language using vocabulary that had survived, new vocabulary for things that didn't exist, right? So things like highway and the word for geography, trains and planes, updating the language. And what really I thought was the crux of this is that he had included easy to learn grammar. Because there are many descendants who speak many different languages now. And if you're going to learn Taino, it better be easy because this is something that you do because you're passionate about it. Don't have a lot of time. So I love that whole idea. And then when I heard him speak about the project, I realized he was really onto something. He used a similar process that was used to create modern Hebrew, which was a language that had not been spoken for many years. It's the same process that is being used to revitalize other indigenous languages as well. And I thought, wow, this is it. I realized this is what I can do. I can use my professional skills because I've been a teacher, I'd worked as a curriculum designer, a tech project manager, helping Indigenous people revitalize their languages, helping government linguists and instructors, K through 12, teachers and students. And I'm bilingual myself. And I thought, well, I can use this book. I'll learn the language. And as I learn, I'll share what I learned with other people and I'll make it accessible to other folks. So, as a person who's a member of Generation X, I turned to technology right away. Now, Generation X, we weren't born with technology. However, we had to learn technology right away. And I began by posting lessons on YouTube. So Casareito's YouTube channel has now more than 450. I mean, it's been pretty incredible. Just lessons on language and on culture. I publish 2 lessons a week, one in English and one in Spanish, to ensure that folks who either speak either one of those languages also have access to the information. So why YouTube? First, I watch a lot of YouTube. I gotta admit, I learn a lot from YouTube, all kinds of stuff. So I figured if I watch YouTube, there must be a lot of other people who do too. And YouTube has more than 2 billion users a month, and you can reach people from around the world. And it's been pretty incredible. I think we've hit every continent. Every continent watches these videos. And folks are learning Taino, folks who are Taino descendants, folks who are just interested in indigenous languages, and folks who are interested in becoming allies are watching these videos and learning along with us. I also started creating my own children's books. I worked in publishing for a long time. I helped to create, like some of the best children's books out there. I worked on the official Dr. Seuss translations in Spanish. And so I was like, yeah, I'm gonna do this for Taino as well. So I used Amazon's print-on-demand services to begin publishing kids' books to teach the new generations about the Taino language and culture, both in English and in Spanish. And I have to say that independent publishing, so these print-on-demand services, not just Amazon's, but other companies have been a huge game changer. They're the great equalizers that are allowing Taino descendants to now publish new books to revitalize our language. The other thing I did was I started working on a first course, a digital course for Taino. Our organization, Casarito, is teaming up with a wonderful nonprofit called 7,000 Languages on the first Taino digital course. But the most amazing thing is that 7,000 Languages uses the tech authoring tool, much of what you see here, that I had helped develop and train government instructors and linguists on, and indigenous communities. And I had worked with the UX and UI teams to add features to make lesson creation easier, to make collaboration easier, not knowing that years later I would be using the same tool to revitalize the Taino language. Now, this course is called Taino Naiki for Beginners, for English speakers. It also has a companion course, Taino Naiki para Principiantes, for Spanish speakers, and it's completely free to everyone. It can be used on any device and from anywhere around the world. The first 4 units are currently available. The rest is still in development, and you can start learning Taino right now. You just sign up for free. Folks get to learn Taino vocabulary, words, phrases. You get to participate in conversation, practice your pronunciation and your typing skills. You get to do all kinds of activities and watch videos, not just learning about Taino people as an extinct people like gone away like the dinosaurs. No, you get to see Taíno people here and now, like the wonderful elder that you see on the screen. And this is a huge first step to making Taíno widely available so that anyone who wants to learn it can learn it. Nowadays, we have 4 Taíno variants. So in the first 3 Taíno variants came in quick succession. The first one was Taíno Naiki by Javier Hernandez, which is now in its 2nd edition. Now it's not just in Spanish, but it's in English. It's this like big, thick, juicy book with lots of grammar, and you can learn in English and in Spanish. And I'm so excited as a language nerd. I got a chance to see this book, and I'm working to create more lessons now that we have more available. In 2019, another variant was published by an author by the name of Richard Porrata, who is a former government instructor and also Taíno Boricua man himself. In 2021, the Hiwatahia variant was published by Cacique Jorge Esteves, who's of Dominican descent. And we just got our last variant, 2024, a variant by Cacique Roberto Mugaro Borrero. It was just released. So now we have 4 different variants of Taíno, all basing themselves on those original vocabulary, words, phrases, and sentences that remain, but all using like different formats, different sister languages to create different variants. Now, even way back when I started a few years ago, I realized that many of us in the community were working in silos, and that the general public didn't even realize that Taíno had been revitalized at all. So in the summer of 2022, a municipality from Puerto Rico reached out and asked if I wanted to collaborate on an event. So I thought this was the perfect chance to start bringing folks together. This is where Reencuentro Taíno Conference was born. We created a space for sharing and learning. We had linguists working on language revitalization come and talk to us about their efforts. We had Taíno teachers show us how they were using songs and ceremonies and virtual platforms and social media to educate. We had filmmakers come and showcase Taíno heritage through their films. So for example, here on the screen, this film, Dr. Taíno, was Oscar nominated way back, or excuse me, Oscar qualified way back in like 2018. And it's by wonderful director and friend Alba Garcia Rivas. The producer on this film was none other than Heather Hansen from the famous Hansen production company, puppetry film. We also had Golden Flower, which was this amazing film I got the chance to collaborate in, directed by Academy Award nominee David Massey. It was the first film to include complete dialogue in Taíno, and it also included English and Spanish, which shows the wonderful way in which we can use languages to bring information across. Golden Flower is a film about our great cacique Ana Caona. We had spiritual leaders come and talk about the origin stories that remain and use language to teach us their original meanings. And we had archaeologists working on all kinds of projects come and share the latest information, from the curator of the Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian Institution, Dr. Curet, who has been studying the Thebes Indigenous Ceremonial Center, all the way to a wonderful archaeologist who's been exploring evidence of an ancient writing system of the Caribbean. So this is incredible to me. About 100 years ago, there was a cache of roughly 800 stones featuring symbols on them that was discovered, but it was dismissed as a hoax. And many of these stones are now in museums around the world. Some of these stones are in Paris. Some of them are in the Peabody Museum here, really close to me in Boston. And Dr. Renier Rodriguez Ramos, who you see on the screen, a few years ago, he just wanted to figure out, what are these stones? People are dismissing them as hoaxes. Well, then let's prove that they're a hoax. So he started analyzing them using modern technology that hasn't existed until very, very recently to try to figure out if these stones were authentic. So during his presentation, he talked about the latest evidence. It proves that the stones were pre-Columbian. Some of them date back to more than 3,100 years ago. They are made with materials, just the similar materials such as that are found on the island of Boriken, so the same type of rock. So it indicates that these stones could have local origins. They also found, for example, here, these are register lines. He had these stones examined by experts, and they say actually register lines indicate how somebody would read something. And therefore, this is probably an established system, not something that, somebody made up one day. They also found things like flecks of gold and ochre in between some of these lines. Um, the highlight for me of this entire presentation was that they have been able to start isolating the symbols found on the stones. So there are 22 symbols that have been isolated so far, and they appear in different rotations. So for example, a symbol may appear like this, or like this, or like this. And they showed them all right here in all the different rotations. And this suggests that it may have been a syllabary. And syllabaries are types of symbols that signify syllables. So like ba, be, bi, bo, bu, for example. And syllabaries tend to have fewer symbols because then, for example, alphabets, which have to have one symbol for each sound, syllabaries, if you rotate the symbol, it has different sounds. So the only thing we know so far is we believe that this was a writing system. We don't quite know what it meant. For example, we don't know what sounds these symbols made, or if they meant something very specific, because we don't have a Rosetta Stone. However, more has to be investigated. We may not know during our lifetime, but I find this type of research incredibly exciting. And I hope that soon others will take up the research so we can find out more. Now, because of this incredible event where we gathered all these people, we were able to partner with UNESCO on the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. However, the first order of business for us was to actually add the Taíno language to the UNESCO website. Because it had been categorized as extinct, we couldn't even upload any of our presentations because the language wasn't there. So the first thing we did was we worked with UNESCO's tech team to add the language to the list. So job one, done, let's add the language. And then after that, we were able to add all of these amazing presentations. So all of our presentations from the conference are up there as resources for the International Decade. So Taínos are now official contributors to the decade, which to me is just incredible. I like 530 some odd years later, now we're official contributors to the decade. I can't stress enough how important modern technology has been to the revitalization of the Taíno language and culture. We have many forward-thinking Taíno elders, such as Miguel Sague Jr., who you see on the screen, who are now sharing their presentations and their storytelling through YouTube, through blogs. He was one of my first inspirations, one of the first people that I came across and I started learning from online. We have spiritual leaders and elders like Irka Mateo, who now holds full moon and solstice gatherings, not just in person, but in Zoom platforms just like this, so that Taínos from around the world can join in and learn. On Spotify, you can find traditional and modern Taíno music. So not just the traditional music using the traditional instruments, but you can find Taíno rap artist and educator Ra Ruiz Leon. She's an amazing educator who teaches via Zoom as well and has rap songs. On Instagram and TikTok, we have the younger generations sharing information as well. And we're using virtual meeting spaces just like this one to have conversations. So for example, tomorrow I'm going to be part of a conversation that includes language warriors from around the world, people who are revitalizing the Nahuatl language, Hawaiian language, Maori, and different variants of Taíno. And we're gathering to talk about some of the challenges, some of the successes, to share ideas. And I feel like this is the future. When we're using this collaborative, interconnected approach, we're ensuring that all of our Indigenous languages survive. Which really leads to some of the work that I'm doing now at the international level. So in May of this year, I had the privilege of being named co-chair for Ad Hoc Group 1 for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. This means that as a leader of this one group, I'm working with 19 other colleagues from around the world, and we're going to be analyzing the current state of education for Indigenous languages across 194 UNESCO member countries. Early next year, we're going to be inviting policymakers and Indigenous communities worldwide to participate in a first of its kind survey so that they can share the insights and challenges and successes, all that information that we need so we can collaborate on making recommendations to ensure that languages, Indigenous languages, survive in the following 1,000 years, 2,000 years, whatever it takes. And for me, this work is deeply moving. I can't imagine, considering that 500 years ago, our ancestors were declared extinct. Now I have the privilege and the opportunity to be able to shape the future of educational policies for not just my own language, but Indigenous languages worldwide. So where are Taínos today? So just as the Taíno language began spreading globally 530 years ago, Taíno people have also spread across the world. In the US alone, there could be as many as 17 million Taíno descendants. We just don't have the numbers. There's no one who has done the research on that. People write to me from all over the world. I heard from a Taíno descendant who is teaching English to Japanese students in Japan, and he uses our lessons to show them how we're connected. That same week, I heard from a Taíno descendant who is teaching Japanese to Canadian students in Canada, which I found absolutely hilarious. And he's also using our videos. I communicate regularly with Taíno descendants in Germany from all over the place who are using our videos to reconnect to our language and our roots. We have Taíno Hawaiian students who are learning one of the variants with my colleague, Ra Ruiz Leon, over Zoom. And they have both Taíno origins and Hawaiian ancestry. There's even a Taíno cultural group out of Boriquen, which is supporting Lokono Arawak speakers in preserving their language while they're learning Lokono to create another variant of Taíno. In our organization itself, we're helping a group from Hawaii do a cultural exchange with Taínos on Boriquen so we can learn together. So for me, these initiatives are going to be vital to continue revitalizing Indigenous language and culture. We're going to need to work together with other Indigenous communities from around the world. So that leaves me to a favor that I need to ask you today. Before you leave, think about something that you learned that touched you. Maybe it was just the fact that the word barbecue comes from Taíno. Maybe there was another fun fact that you learned. And I would love for you to share that with a friend or a family member, one person, because I know that you'll share that with one person, that person will share it with another, and that person will share it with another. And before you know it, millions more will know that Taínos are here, that we have not gone extinct, that we are helping to revitalize not just our language and our culture, but other languages from around the world. So before I end, one of my favorite quotes comes from Oprah Winfrey, who was in turn quoting a poem by Maya Angelou. And she says, "I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. When I do this work, when I step into these meetings, when I prepare for these presentations, when I speak with people like you from around the world, I feel my ancestors with me. I feel the thousands of women and men who were silenced for so long, who now get to be heard through me, through my voice, and the countless other descendants who are doing this work, who are ensuring that our language and our culture survive." So now that you've heard a little bit about me and a little bit about my ancestors, I would love to formally introduce myself. Dakanulia Priscilla Colon, Daktoka Taíno. My name is Priscilla Colon. I am Taíno. Ha home. Thank you.